Hey, it's Professor Wham putting this together. This is going to be a loose presentation. What I do want to say in this presentation is that this may be the last presentation that I do that has this specific format. I don't know that for sure, but I'm in the process of investigating some different modalities for what I do. And it's not that I'll quit doing paranormal stuff or anything like that, but I'm receiving accelerated requests to do several different kinds of presentations. And this may necessitate me going to some different platforms. I've already purchased some technology to help me with that, but this is just sort of letting people know that there may be changes afoot on the channel. But like I said, I will always do some paranormal stuff. But what I wanted to do is talk a little bit about the types of experiences that I've had and that a lot of other people have had that I think in many ways are more common than some of the standard sort of paranormal events that are reported and then described as paranormal. I'm sure, like many of you, I've been experiencing the last few weeks as something almost out of time, liminal even. And I know that the effect of disorientation, this effect that many of us have been feeling, is intended by those who are intent on destroying the world that has been collectively created. So for me, the challenge really has been to work on not actively panicking about it while helping to build my contributions to resistance, and also just sort of to understand bigger pictures. And by what I mean by bigger pictures are not conspiracy theory pictures. Conspiracy theories are not actually bigger pictures. I mean this in a more cosmic sense, I guess, if you know, for want of a better word. Now, mentioned in a previous video, namely the one that I just finished, that I'm actually going to be completing the blog portion of, it's helped me quite a bit to think of the changes that we've been going through as akin to the disruptions and risks that took place during the pandemic. The only difference is that the changes that are being sought are deliberate with malice aforethought, so that in that sense, the trauma is more personal, especially if it affects you directly. So in some ways, this is more like a nuclear war of the heart and mind, and that's kind of how I've seen it. A disaster in smaller incremental portions, yet buoyed by a psychic poison that is just as radioactive, that is just as potentially poisonous. Now, as in all things, my response to it all was to go directly into meditation. That's always what I do. After all these years, it was automatic. And this is not because I'm so noble, but because I'm not on medication and I don't really drink alcohol anymore. From there, I began to get guidance. And it was interesting where that guidance took me, at least for this kind of a presentation. That's really all I need at this point, is like, what's the next thing to do and what's the next thing to do? You know, those are the things that I seek. So guidance pointed me to a book that has been on my shelves for many years. I have actually considered doing this book. I just haven't gotten around to it. And I've read this book a number of times. And this is a book by Jenny Randalls. It is called Time Storms. If you look in my little window, I will show you this right here. Who is one of my favorite paranormal writers and investigators. She's from the UK. Now, Time Storms is a fascinating collection of experiences, both individual and collective, which involve the losing or gaining of time, the displacement of people from one place to another without any obvious means of transport, or both, instances where both time and space appear to be altered together. these cases, there are many of them in which both people or many people experience these things at once, and then there are some cases where people experience these things individually. Now, in this book, Time Storms, Randalls is attempting to explore the possibility that many of these experiences, some of which are or have been mistaken for UFO abductions, even when no obvious light or craft was observed, constitute a genuinely separate phenomenon that she argues is natural, if intermittent, and that has been recorded throughout human history. Now, so there's two main parts to the book. The first part is her attempting to categorize various of these accounts. Although what's interesting about it is, though, even though she tries to do that, you'll see very quickly when you read them that these accounts sort of bleed into each other. They aren't as clearly differentiated from one another as one would think. And then in the second part, she gets into possible explanations. And they're not really explanations so much as they are ideas about where research about these phenomena could begin. So she can't really get to the why of the experience directly, but she does connect some interesting dots using new physics. And of course, this book was written back in, I think it was in the 90s, early 2000s or something like that when it was published. So physics has gone even further than when she was writing this. Including the many worlds theory, the speculations of J.G. Young and Wolfgang Pauli. And she draws certain threads between the experiences of time loss and gain, synchronicity, and deja vu. So of all the things that she covers, various of the accounts include things like this losing or gaining of time, spatial disturbances, appearances, and disappearances. She has an entire chapter on synchronicity, which of course is something that is of extreme importance to me and a number of other people who study paranormal phenomena. She connects this with dreams and out-of-body experiences because there are some of the experiences that she recounts include dreams and include out-of-body experiences as part of the overall complex of any given report. And she also talks about deja vu, which is interesting. And that's interesting to me specifically because I have had some very particular experiences of deja vu, which, in fact, deja vu and synchronicity to me are of a piece because they inform one another and have in my life. The only issue that I have with Jenny Randalls is she does give a brief explanation about science, and she says, how modern science is a combination of logic or reason and intuition. It's like, no, actually modern science is logic and reason and mathematics and experimentation. Intuition comes into it, but the experimentation part is really, really important. Her definition of science is the way Aristotle did it. It's not the way physicists do it. And she doesn't talk about the importance of mathematics in modern physics in particular, which she mentions it, but it's obviously not a topic that she knows a lot about, so she can't get into the minutiae about it. So it was interesting that this particular book presented itself to me at this time, and because I have been experiencing a lot of deja vus and synchronicities, and whenever I have deja vus and synchronicities occurring in my life, this is a signal to me to pay really, really close attention to what is going on with me and also what is going on in the world. More than any other specific paranormal experience, and I've talked at various lengths in different places about my UFO experiences or my Bigfoot experiences, but more than any other kind of experience that I've had, I have lived through multiple examples of time displacements, physical displacements of objects, deja vus, synchronicity, out-of-body experiences. This is really sort of where where I've lived my entire life. It's part of the reason why I like David Lynch, because I don't experience life in a really linear way. I have to sort of force myself into linear patterns for other people's sake. And that's always been true ever since I was a child. While others have had many, many UFO, Bigfoot, or ghost encounters, I have had so many time-space storms that when I sit down and try to remember or record them, I simply lose count. In some ways, for me at least, this would seem to confirm that Randall's assertion that these kinds of experiences are much more common than are generally considered. It rings true to me, because these are the kinds of experiences that tend to be discounted. But she considers them to be more common, actually. In fact, almost all of us have had some experience of this at some point. I've had so many of these experiences that while I pay attention to them, they no longer frighten me. They used to frighten me. Now, the term time storm, as she describes it, is sometimes used in science fiction stories to describe any kind of temporal or spatial displacement. In fact, just last week, I was rewatching a Star Trek Discovery episode, and this precise term was used to talk about such a phenomenon in whatever the episode was. Now, I know the phrase was used by science fiction writer Gordon R. Dickson in his 1992 novel by the same name. But I don't know whether he coined it. I don't know. Now, I presume that Randalls is familiar with this term due to its usage in the science fiction genre. My having this book is interesting, too. When I first ordered this book from Amazon some time ago, I had trouble getting it, not because it was hard to get, but because Amazon lost the book twice, and the book never showed up. And then I was finally sent a book, and the book that I was sent was an out-of-print manual. It was like a study manual for internal medicine, like surgery. It was like, what? It was bizarre. So I had to send it back and get a refund from Amazon. And then finally, like about the third time I ordered it, I finally got it. It was very strange. It's like, why am I having such a hard time getting this book? So anyway, when you think about it, and this is part of the reason why she picks this topic or this title, time storms. Storms are caused by contending or overlapping forces that are seeking equilibrium. And this is pretty much how Randalls seems to see the phenomena that she's describing. If one lives in a universe where multiple realities might converge, and is, after all, composed of energy and energy frequencies and that sort of thing, then it isn't too far-fetched to speculate that there are times when some of these realities might meet or clash in some way, and when they do that, these kinds of weird distortions occur. Now, of course, this doesn't explain all the components of such experiences. It's just a launching off point. Randalls doesn't really try to explain everything that she's describing precisely either. I think, from what I could tell of the first part of the book, part of the reason she's using this idea of time storms is she's trying to get past some of the weird stuff that had started to crop up in the UFO abduction community in the late 90s and early 2000s. And she's looking at the possibility that there might be something more basic at work here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read some accounts of hers, and then I'm going to tell you some things that have happened to me. Some of the things that have happened to me are kind of weird, and some of the stories that she describes are kind of weird too. So we'll just kind of go from there, and you can kind of get a sense of what I'm talking about and what she's talking about. Now, again, we're talking about temporal and spatial displacements. We're talking about synchronicities and deja vus and out-of-body experiences. All these kinds of things where it feels like our physical reality and our sense of time are disturbed, distorted, or even violated. So this is from her chapter in the book called Trips Through Time. This happened in 1981 and was reported to her later in Linhares, Brazil. On the 20th of April, 1981, Jorge Ramos, a representative for a chemical company, left his home in Linhares, Brazil at 6 p.m. to drive the few miles to a meeting. He never arrived to that meeting. When his wife, Noemia, reported his disappearance to the police that night, she feared foul play, for he was normally scrupulous about reporting his movements. The next day, the police began to investigate, and before long made a disturbing discovery. The Volkswagen car driven by Ramos was found on a side road just off the BR 101, only a few miles outside of Linhares. The key was still in the ignition. All his papers were intact. His samples and files for the meeting were lying there undisturbed. It was as if he had been abducted from the car, but there was no sign of a struggle. The car was taken to police headquarters and subjected to forensic tests. There was no clue as to what had happened to Ramos, not until 5 days after his disappearance, when Noemia received a frantic call from her husband. Ramos said that he had been driving to the appointment when suddenly he saw a white glow heading towards him. Before he could react, it had enveloped the car. He felt a sense of pressure on him, making it hard to move, and pains in his muscles. Then he found himself in a dreamy, floating state. In the next instant, he was coming to with his body still sore and disoriented. The car was gone. He was standing by an unfamiliar road, but was relieved to find all his money and personal possessions on him intact. He had no idea how he had got to where he was, but had to buy some medication to try to relieve the pains that were causing tingling sensations in his body. Upon arrival at the pharmacy, he discovered for the first time the startling truth about his relocation. Ramos learned that not only was it no longer the evening of April 20th, it was in fact the 25th, but that he was nowhere near either his car or his home. In fact, he was in the town of Guianawa, some 600 miles from where his car was discovered by the police. Now, in this case, Ramos had lost time. My first memory of these kinds of experiences that I can really pinpoint was an instance of gaining time. And this happened in the first grade. In order to talk about this, I have to explain first that when I was that young, I had trouble figuring out how to tell time from a clock. This was in the 60s. We didn't have digital clocks at the time. We just had the round things, with the hands on them. I had trouble figuring out how to tell time from that, and I learned gradually how to tell the time based on repetitive things that happened and were said by others to be at certain times. For example, there were some television shows that came on at the same time every week. Father left for work by a certain time. The school bell rang for lunch or recess or at the end of day at certain times. And whenever that repetitive thing would happen, I would look at a clock and try to memorize the position of the hands. The whole thing about time honestly made no sense to me. It seems strange and interesting to me now, when I look back on it, given how meticulously I'm able to make it to work at about the same time every day, that I ever had problems with this. Now, when my family lived on the farm, I was able to figure out roughly when lunch or dinner was because of the position of the sun in the sky, and that's literally how I told time. My parents tried to get me watches several times, but the watches would always stop working after about a week or two. They just stopped. It wasn't because of anything I had done. So I literally had to learn how to tell time in other ways. But I knew I was supposed to figure out this clock thing, so I just worked at it, and I kept my ineptitude to myself. And in fact, it wasn't until I was in middle school that I actually realized I had figured out how to tell time. Now, what that meant is that I paid a lot of attention to our class schedule, whatever it was, and how it corresponded to what the clock said. In first grade, I went to a private school, and we would always have a bit of a break in the afternoon. It wasn't recess, as afternoon recess came not long after lunch, but it was a kind of short nap time. We'd put our heads on the desk for about 20 minutes at what I now know was 2 p.m. We got out at 3:30 p.m., or that's what the clock said, so after the break we didn't have much time left in the day, although as one might imagine, it often seemed like an eternity to me. Anyway, one day we were following our schedule, nothing unusual. Time came for us to put our heads down on the desk. I glanced up at the clock to register the time as 2 p.m., so I was, trying to memorize the position of the hands. I put my head down and actually fell asleep, which was a little unusual. Normally I just kind of dozed, but was aware of what was going on around me. I woke up a couple of times and checked the clock each time, and time was moving slowly forward because I was checking it all the time. My fellow students had their heads down. So one of the times I'd fallen asleep, I was awakened by my teacher's voice, and I sat up. My fellow students sat up. We'd all had our heads down. I noticed that something seemed a little unusual because normally the teacher would kind of wake us gently and pause. But this time it was like she just started talking. Actually, she seemed somewhat upset with us, and as my brain cleared, I glanced at the clock, and it seemed to say what I thought was 1 p.m. Seriously, the teacher told us that we shouldn't be napping during class because that would mean it would be hard for us to rest when the time came. Then we continued with a lesson, as if the lesson had begun, but it hadn't. My books, all of our books, were in our desk, and the teacher didn't notice. I was completely confused, but paid attention anyway. When the time came at 2 p.m., we all put our heads down again, exactly like we had previously, but this time I didn't sleep because I was trying to figure it out. To this day, I have no idea what happened here or why my fellow students and I seemed to share this experience, even though when I tried to talk to a couple of them about it, they didn't know what I was saying and why the teacher didn't notice. They actually didn't know what I was talking about. Now, since then, I've gained time a couple of other times, once at work and once again while I was teaching. Yeah, the teaching one was pretty strange too. It's odd to do a lecture twice. It's very strange to go through the same sequence of events twice and you're the only person who notices. I've actually lost time, and I mean lost time more than just a perception, but measurably lost time at least 3 times that I can recall off the top of my head. So that's been a more common occurrence, is me actually losing time. Here's an interesting little case. This happened in Medway, the UK in 1980. Edith Sage is a mother of 3 from the Medway area of Kent. On the 4th of August, 1980, a warm, sunny afternoon, she was walking to the local corner shop to get some peas, annoyed at having forgotten them during an earlier shopping trip. Then at 4:50 p.m., as she was walking down a small alley, quote, "Out of the corner of my eye, something in the sky made me jump. It was like a smoke ring going round and round with sorts of sparks coming out the edge of it," unquote. So far, this sounds like a classic case of what she describes, or Randles describes, as an electrified mist, as seen in many other time storm reports. But behind the smoke, Edith saw what looked like a futuristic helicopter start to appear. It was basically a large transparent bubble with military green and tan markings like camouflage. Inside the bubble were 2 human beings wearing jumpsuits. They were definitely just normal people. That's what they looked like. Mrs. Sage stared at this scene as she walked towards the shops. Then she noticed that strange state that we recognize once again as the Oz factor. And of course, Randles is the person who popularized calling it this, the Oz factor. Quote, "Everything was muted. It was as if I was hearing things from inside something." Apart from this effect, and even after the helicopter, quote unquote, arrived, a peculiar mist clung to the picket fence between herself and the object. It smelt sickly, and she went dizzy. What happened next may or may not be a real experience. It was visionary in nature and involved dreamlike events. It may simply be an hallucination triggered by the time storm energy fields. She heard the two men inside the helicopter talking, quote unquote, inside my head and saying, "You said it would be all right. I know, and it's all right. She thinks we are Army." In other words, this was an impossibly overheard yet oddly rational conversation that conveys the impression of Mrs. Sage having accidentally stumbled across some sort of experiment to whose success her presence was considered a threat. In a daze, Edith reports how she walked down the alley, leaving the helicopter still there. She bought her peas, had a conversation with a woman in the shop about a wedding, and then went on with the day as if the incident had never taken place. Indeed, as the hours passed, she quickly and initially forgot all about it. What's interesting is that I've come across a number of different experiences like this, and I recount one of them in my book, Mysterious Beauty, when I'm talking to one of my subjects in part 2, a guy named Jimmy Bay. And I had been interviewing him about an experience that he had immediately following a horrible accident that almost killed him, literally. And while he was in that state of injury, he had this spiritual experience that had some fairly far-reaching and rather remarkable results. But at one point in that interview, I asked him, "So, Jimmy, have you had any other kinds of odd experiences?" And he sat there and then proceeded to tell me about this bizarre experience that he and several friends had when they were much younger, where they had encountered some bouncing lights. They were on their way to a dinner party and dance, and they had encountered some bouncing lights that had completely discombobulated them. And as he talked to me, he realized that they had lost several hours of time and then had just gone on like they didn't remember. So after that experience, after he told me that, he actually went and found those friends and asked them about the experience. There were like 3 other friends with him. One of them didn't remember anything. Another one did remember some stuff, or did remember the experience, kind of. The other person remembered but would not speak of it. So it's just interesting how different people react to these kinds of experiences. Now, I've lost time, like I said, and I mean actually lost time more than once, at least 3 times, major instances that I can remember off the top of my head. But the most consequential of these, especially since other people were involved, occurred in 2011, around 2011, 2012, here in the Hudson Valley, while I was out with my 2 partners at the time, picking blueberries in the Mohonk Reserve, or in the Gunks. And this was, of course, in the Mid-Hudson Valley. Now, there are several ridges in the Mohonk Preserve that are known for their amazing abundance of wild blueberries. About 4 to 5 varieties can be found on these ridges. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, poor folks would comb the site to sell the berries, to collect them and sell them to the rich resorts that served city people just down the hill. There's a number of resorts in the Mohonk Preserve. And that's how poor people would make their living during the summer. Now, local small forest fires are relatively common on these ridges, and blueberries flourish in the soil and forest openings created by the fires. One does have to watch for rattlesnakes and bears, but it is incredibly easy to pick literally a year's worth of fruit to freeze in just a few hours, walking up one of the hidden trails along the hills. Many of these trails are not official, they're not marked, but are known to locals, which are the results of both long indigenous and then working class usage. This time I decided, rather spontaneously, to go up blueberry picking as a celebration of my birthday, which in summer often falls right during the height of the blueberry crop. My 2 partners at the time were going to accompany me. So everything was normal at first. We got to the hidden trailhead that we knew about. It's off the beaten path and over a creek bed that is itself rather hidden. The trail is steep and rocky. The gunks are formed of a metaphoric conglomerate that is very durable, harder than concrete, and so it doesn't break down into nice little pebbles, so it's very rocky up there. There are places where the ascent levels off and you can spread off to pick. Now, I already know what 411 people that are into 411 are saying. Oh, lots of rocks, lots of berries, dangerous place. Now, at one point while we were picking, I got this, and this was retrospectively kind of an odd impulse, to go further up the trail by myself. This is unusual for me because I'm very cautious about rattlesnakes and bears. And I'm also very cautious about the possibility of meeting other humans with poor intentions on isolated trails. So the fact that I would have this kind of impulse to do that, at the time it seemed normal, but retrospectively it was odd. But for some reason I said I wanted to go up the trail a bit and that I'd be back soon. My partner said they'd wait for me and pick where they were and more gradually ascend. There were plenty of berries where they were. So, they weren't in a hurry to join me. So I started up the trail. Originally, I didn't intend to go very far. I would walk a bit, then stop and pick, walk a bit further, then stop and pick. What I do remember is that at some point, I felt like I was seized with a strange euphoria. I felt all prickly and kind of hot. It was like a sudden fever had come on. But often when I get sick with something, like a serious illness, I get a weird euphoria. And what that is a fever. I began to ascend more rapidly and to pick less. It felt like something was driving me towards something. But at the time, it seemed really normal. It was retrospectively, again, it was weird. I tried to stop myself several times and settle down to picking in a specific area, but it was like something kept pushing me forward. I started to feel lightheaded. And I had brought water, and I did stop to drink. It was kind of hot and humid outside. I also checked my time as I went. I had my cell phone on me. My coverage registered as good. My physical responses seemed curious to me at the time, but oddly, I wasn't really thinking about it too much. It was as if I wasn't in complete control of my body. It was almost like my body was being propelled in some way. Finally, I forced myself to stop. According to my phone, I'd been climbing or on this trail for 30 minutes. I was on a more level area, and I could see a field of blueberries and other vegetation climbing up another rise to the west. I noticed that the air seemed very still and charged. There was no breeze. And my skin kind of tingled and prickled like there was static in the air. I wondered if a storm was picking up because it felt a little like another terrifying experience I'd had in Estes Park years earlier when I'd gotten caught in a pop-up thunderstorm above the tree line and had to literally run for my life as lightning struck around me. This was not a paranormal event. This was a stupid thing that I did. Then I saw one of the strangest things. As I was looking on to the west over the berry bushes, and it kind of extended for quite a little distance, maybe a quarter mile or more, in front of me, I saw a strange motion coming through the vegetation. At first it looked like just some weird breeze, but then it sped up and it looked like it was parting the bushes in front of it. Think of how the bow of a boat or a ship parts the water as it races through it. This was exactly how this wind or movement looked, but it was sweeping down the rise through the bushes towards me. This happened so quickly and was so strange that I just stood there and watched it approach. I could only discern the movement of the wind by the vegetation that it was moving through. There wasn't any other breeze or wind. It was absolutely silent, and I noticed the silence. And I've done this for so long, I kind of know what that means, sort of. All of a sudden, there was a presence. I can't call it any more than that. Right above me, probably not more than 20 feet or so. It was like this incredible pressure from above. I had broken out in a cold sweat, and I felt this pressure from above, like something pressing down on me. And I know this sounds incredibly bizarre, but I knew that it was alive. And I knew that it was watching me, that it was above me and it was like pressing down and watching me. I felt it looking down on me, and that it had a power that I didn't understand. I could look up and I didn't see anything. I couldn't see anything. I didn't see a mist. I didn't see distortion. There was nothing there. All I could do was feel this intense pressure. I also felt sort of like an invader. It was mostly a feeling. All at once, I remembered that I had some tobacco with me. I'd started carrying some with me whenever I went into the woods at the suggestion of one of my indigenous teachers. I reached in my pocket while looking above, dug some out, and rapidly did blessings to the directions and then to whatever it was above me. And as soon as I did that, it was like it was gone. The pressure was gone. Boom, just like that. It was like it just departed. I felt and heard a kind of whooshing sound, and I was left with my sweaty self, and I also was kind of freaked out. So I decided to get back to my friends as soon as possible. I started to run back down the trail as fast as the rough rocks would let me without spraining my ankle. I stopped briefly at one point to check my phone, and it told me that only another 10 minutes had passed, so I figured I'd be back to my friends pretty quickly. However, it seemed to take a lot longer to get down than it had for me to ascend, even though I was, at least to me, going much faster. At one point, I passed a couple who were slowly ascending the trail, and I thought for a moment that I should warn them, but about what? How weird would that be? There's this thing that might follow you, you know. What do you say, you know? I was starting to get frustrated with the apparent slowness of my descent when I heard shouting. I kept going and was met by both my partners, who were both relieved and distressed. Apparently, I'd been gone for almost 4 hours. And they had started coming further up the trail to try to find me because they thought something had happened to me. When they told me that, I looked at my phone and it registered the discrepancy. According to it, by the time I reached them, only about 90 minutes had passed. But I had had connection service the whole time. The phone did not correct until that evening. Now, maybe the phone was malfunctioning in some way, although I had my GPS on and it never has done that before, and it never did again, and it registered, like I said, cell coverage the whole time. It was very difficult for me to believe that I'd been gone that long, but when I observed the lengthening shadows as we walked back to the car, I had to admit that, at least for them, I'd been gone longer than I thought. Something happened, but I don't know what. And here's another little story from Time Storms. This happened again in the UK at Harperig Reservoir in 1992. On the 17th of August 1992, Gary Wood and Colin Wright drove across the moors west of Edinburgh carrying a satellite TV tuner that they were delivering to a friend at Tarbrax. To reach this very isolated village off the A70 requires a drive of 20 miles through virtually uninhabited countryside that includes several reservoirs and the Pentland Hills. Sometime after 11 p.m. they were halfway there and not close to any village, but near the Harperig Reservoir above the starlit road on their left. Suddenly Colin yelled to Gary, who was driving, and instinctively Gary put his foot down, taking them into the approaching blind corner at speed. Colin had seen a large mass ahead of them and only 20 feet above the road. By accelerating, Gary was seeking to drive under it and escape. It was an unthinking reaction to a perceived danger. Within moments, they were underneath the mass, and several events rapidly followed. First, the Oz factor took hold as all sounds disappeared. A strange state of disassociation came over them. The car radio faded into silence. But the oddest part was how what seemed like a shimmering curtain of mist had descended along with, or perhaps now was, the dark mass. And there was no way to avoid driving into this. Once inside the dark mist, there was nothing but blackness. Every light, from the stars, from their headlamps, was swallowed up in an inky void. Colin reports, "I kept thinking that we were going to crash into a field because There was another tight bend right after this first one, but for some reason we did not do so. What happened next utterly stunned these two men, but will not surprise readers of this book. As if it had been sucked up off the road and then dropped, although they do not recall this happening, the car hit the tarmac with a heavy jolt. The black curtain had gone, and the stars were visible again. Somehow they had gone through the tight bends without catastrophe, and were correctly aligned on the I-70 some distance further along, driving as if nothing had happened. They were perplexed, but continued to Tarbrax, arriving to their astonishment in the early morning. Some hours had seemingly just vanished. At their friend's house, the expressions on their faces told the story. The two men also began to exhibit symptoms such as pounding headaches and muscular aches, and described feeling in a very weird state of consciousness, as if their minds were not quite in phase with their bodies. They likened it to being on powerful medication. Some of these after effects lasted well into the next day. I have had weird displacements of objects. This has happened numerous times to me. Disappearances and displacements. Here we have displacements of people, what I just read to you. Fortunately, in my case, most of these disappearances have involved objects and not people, and not me either. But one of the most notable examples that I remember occurred not long after I graduated from high school. This would have been in 1979, and was attending a community college near me in Overland Park, Kansas. At the time, I had moved back in with my mother pending my relocation to a new apartment. I also worked at the community college in the acquisitions department of the library. Now, even then I was a book hound and would always be coveting books I couldn't afford, especially at the college bookstore. You know how expensive those books are. Since I was an employee at the library, the help there would let me put deposits on books and then hold them for me so that I could pay for them over time. It wasn't something that they would do for anybody else just because I happened to work at the college. I had spied a book I really wanted, and I can't remember what it was about now, but I didn't have the $10 that I needed to put the bookstore on hold for me. So I decided to ask one of my older co-workers in the library if she would lend me $10. It took a little convincing, as she was a single mom who really didn't have much money herself, but she did finally relent. So she handed over a $10 bill, and I folded it and stuck it in my left jacket pocket. At that time in my life, I wore Army surplus clothes, and this jacket was one of those simple olive green overcoat jackets that didn't have all the complicated compartments in the pockets. The pocket did have a button, though, and after I put the bill in my pocket, I fastened the pocket shut. I then walked straight to the bookstore, which took about 10 minutes from my location on the second floor of the library. The route took me down some stairs, out the front door of the library, across a small courtyard, and into another building where I eventually came to another staircase which descended to the level of the bookstore and cafeteria. It was straightforward, and I didn't pause to talk to anyone or do anything else on the route. I got to the bookstore, went and found the book, and unbuttoned the pocket to pull out the $10 bill so I could take it up to the counter to reserve it, except that the $10 bill was gone. I frantically started looking for it around me on the floor. I was the only person right in that part of the store. I looked under the shelves, around the books. It was nowhere to be seen. I remember getting an incredulous cold prickle up my spine. I checked my pocket. There was no hole, no secret lining in which the money could have gotten stuck or was hiding. I retraced my steps multiple times along the route I'd taken back and forth. While I had no idea how the money might have gotten out of my pocket, I wanted to check to see if it was on the ground or floor anywhere, even though obviously if it had been, somebody would have picked it up. I even looked around my co-worker's desk. I mean, who knows? She had seen me put it in my pocket. The money was never found, and I had to pay my friend back without actually getting the book in question. When I paid her back, I told her what had happened. She was a rather suspicious person, not of me, but of the spirit world, and declared that I probably wasn't supposed to have the book. I guess in some way I had concluded that myself. Now, in another instance many years ago, when I was living in one of the many haunted dwellings in which I seemed to occupy, my wallet disappeared very suddenly. It had money in it and all my ID, and it took weeks to get all that figured out. A couple months after the disappearance, the damn thing showed up again, stashed under the cushions of a couch in a room I never went in. It was in a storage area that was maintained by the landlord, but she was never on the property, so it wasn't a case that she or someone took it and put it in there. The only reason it was found was that a member of her family had decided to use that couch and came over one day to fetch it, pulled the cushions off, and the wallet was there. They looked in it and found it was mine and returned it to me. All the money and the ID was there. It's like, for fuck's sake. So this next one happened just last year, and this was a physical displacement, a very obvious physical displacement. I've had several instances of these, but I hadn't had one for a while when I had this one. The most recent was about a year ago, as I mentioned. I'd come down in the morning to make my coffee. It was on a Saturday, so I wasn't moving quite as quickly as I do during the week while prepping for work. I remember I was a little annoyed with myself because I hadn't set the coffee up the night before. I like to do that so that I don't have to really think about it that much, because I have to go out and do the chickens. And, if I just have the coffee being prepared while I do those other things, it helps. As I stood by the sink washing my cup, I noticed that my partner hadn't put something away that he said he would. Whatever it was next to the sink. Now, of course, I don't remember what it was. Whatever the item was, from my perspective, it should have been in the sink. Maybe to soak or something, because he was always telling me to do things like that. What I do remember is that I saw it while standing at the sink, was sitting on the counter, and instantly felt a very intense and deep sense of anger and frustration. It was because it was the kind of thing he might complain to me about doing, and here he was doing it himself. And, in retrospectively, I was actually pissed about other things. I was kind of mad at myself, but there was this intense flush of anger, I remember. My eyes flicked back to the item I was washing for a moment, and then just as quickly returned to the item which had generated this intense, but now rather silly, it seems, emotional reaction. However, when my eyes returned to the object, I noticed it was no longer where it had been, but was in the sink, right underneath my hands, which was finishing up the cup I'd started to clean. I had not moved it, and it had not been there literally a second before. I remember standing there very still for quite a little while, trying to figure out how the object could have simply moved its position without my having manually done that. It was creepy and interesting, but it popped me right out of my bad mood. So maybe that's why it happened. And here's a lovely little account. And this account is interesting because if you listen to it carefully and you know anything about the Betty and Barney Hill UFO abduction account, you'll recall that they had a similar experience where they had stopped at a roadside place and they could not find it. And in fact, could not find the road that they turned down in order to have their experience. This happened in France in 1979. Montpellier is the location. It happened in October 1979. The Simpson and Gisby families went on holiday together, driving from Kent to Spain via France. As I have learned from meeting 3 of the 4 witnesses, they had an odd experience when seeking overnight accommodation near Montpellier. As they drove along a back road, the Oz factor took hold, with all sounds muting and traffic disappearing. Then they found an isolated small hotel and stayed the night, but faced 3 big problems. Problem 1 was that it was like a hotel out of time. The staff and guests all wore old-fashioned clothes. A policeman whom they asked for directions did not recognize the word autoroute or motorway, and the bill was ridiculously cheap. Problem 2 was that several photos they took at the hotel do not exist. When the film was processed, despite them all remembering taking these shots, they were just simply not there. The final problem was that on the return journey, an attempt to stay again in this quaint theme hotel failed as they could not find it. Extensive research, including return trips to France, have also failed to find any hotel on this dusty rural road. I love stories like that. And like I said, Betty and Barney Hill had a very similar experience as part of their overall abduction encounter. If you go back and reread The Interrupted Journey. And there are a number of other people who have had these kinds of experiences. I've actually I have friends who've had these experiences where they went on vacation and they encountered a person or a place that later on, and they even took pictures with that person or did interactions with that person or stayed at a place that now no longer exists. One of the individuals that I interviewed for my dissertation had an extended experience. She was traveling with a friend, and they met an individual on their they were traveling to China, and on their way to China, they encountered a woman who they befriended and who gave them information about a place to stay in China. She said she'd been several times, and she actually gave them, told them her name and that sort of thing. And so they went to look up this place that she told them about, and that place did exist, and they did have a good time there and everything. And this woman said that she gave them further information where they could meet her. She said she was going to China, that she was going to another place in China in order to do some business, and said that she would meet up with them at a certain point, and that she had made reservations at such and such a place and that she would meet them. And so during that time, they decided they would go to that place, and she didn't show up. And so they felt bad about that. Maybe something had happened, but they did a little bit of checking. And I mean, it's a long story, but it turns out that this woman never existed. There's no record of this woman anywhere. There's no record of that woman being on the plane with them. There's no record of a woman. This woman literally did not exist, as far as they could tell. It's very interesting. Now, my favorite story of displacement actually comes from an acquaintance of mine. I still consider him a friend, even though he has fallen off the face of the earth, and not in the same way. I actually know what happened to him. I just don't know what's happened to him subsequent to the thing that I know happened to him. I'm sure he's still around. He's probably just hiding from the federal government. That was his tendency anyway. And I'll call him Steve. According to him, and this guy was a truthful guy. He had a lot of wild experiences. In fact, he was the first cousin of one of the actors who was in the show Northern Exposure. The guy who played, I think it was, the guy's name was Ed. He was the indigenous kid. I think his name was Ed in the show. But he was like a first cousin to this guy. So he had some interesting connections to Hollywood and to Southern California. But he was living in Kansas City when I knew him. And he had a lot, he worked at the Renaissance Festival. I knew him from a number of different communities. But he had many interesting experiences, but he told me the story, and he was completely sober when he told me this. He said this was one of the weirdest experiences he'd ever had. According to Steve, as I'll call him, he and some friends were taking a spontaneous road trip through an extremely rural part of Kansas. Now, in rural Kansas, all journeys from here to there could be considered road trips. They were going down county highways and side roads, some only half paved, others gravel. They were just having a good time. Eventually, several of them, as they were driving around, agreed that the group should stop to walk around, answer calls of nature, and such like. The problem was they were very far away from any facilities. Small towns were few and far between, and it was the weekend. So even when they got to a small burg, many places to rest were closed, as they are wont to be, especially this was maybe 30 years ago. Finally, as they were driving down this one road, they drove through a construction site that was along the way, and they noticed there was a porta potty. So at least they thought they might be able to take advantage of this, as, some of them had had various types of calls of nature. Steve remembered being the third guy into the porta potty, and he said he was impressed that there was still some toilet paper left. He settled in to do his business. He could hear the guys outside. It was hot and smelly inside this shit cubicle, as he called it, so he didn't want to stay in it any longer than necessary. As he was finishing up, the following things seemed to happen. Initially, he said he noticed that it suddenly got very quiet outside. He assumed that something had gotten the attention of his friends, and so he was very eager to get out of this hot, stinky rectangle, just so he could join them and see what they were looking at. Then, as he stood up and reassembled himself, he was struck by a sudden bout of dizziness and nausea. He said it quickly passed through his mind that maybe the heat inside the toilet was to blame, but then it was as if he blacked out. And the next thing he remembered was awakening face down in the dirt. He said it was as if he had suddenly awakened from a deep sleep, so he kind of jumped a little. He had no idea where he was and no memory of how he had gotten there, so he just laid there for a few minutes, but he noticed he was soaking wet. When he finally sat up, he realized he didn't recognize anything around him. He said, I looked down at my clothes and my belt was still unbuckled. I immediately thought this was some kind of practical joke, but none of my friends were around. There wasn't any sign of them. He told me that as he gradually rose to his feet and buckled his belt, his sense of confusion began to transform into a bit of panic, because it seemed like he was all alone in the middle of nowhere. Had his friends dumped him for some reason to leave him to find his way back, and why? I mean, they were known to play practical jokes, but not anything quite like this. And how had he gotten so wet? It didn't seem like it was sewage that had soaked him, which is kind of what you'd think, you know. It just seemed like it was water. He said his brain felt fuzzy, almost as though he was high, and although he was known to be 420 and hallucinogen friendly, he was not using at the time. And that wouldn't automatically explain why he was face down in a ditch. He then noticed that there was a road to his left, so he walked over to it and surveyed it first one way and then the next. It seemed unfamiliar, and he had no idea which direction to go. After standing there for a while, he just picked one and started down it. He said, I have no idea where I was going, but there was a road, and it was the only thing I could think of to do, was just pick a direction and go. After walking for a while, he estimated at least 40 minutes or so, but he didn't have a watch, so he didn't actually know for sure. It might have been shorter. He decided to take a bit of a break under some trees at the side of the road because he was beginning to get worried. It was Kansas, hot, and he had no water, and he was in an isolated area. At this point, the real issue for me was making sure I could find other humans. I would figure out what had happened later, he told me. He started walking again, and this time, after about 10 or 15 minutes, again by his estimation, he heard voices in the distance. The voices were raised, people shouting. They seemed to be coming in, the voices seemed to be coming in from in front of him, so he began to quicken his pace, like they were down the road, so he began to quicken his pace. All at once, it seemed like he suddenly recognized where he was. I was kind of jogging along, and I saw this busted up tree and some road machinery that looked familiar. I jogged on a little more and saw some construction cones and barrels up ahead. The yelling was getting louder, and as I approached and passed the cones, I realized that I did recognize where I was, because right up the way was the porta potty. I think I hadn't recognized where I was before because we'd all been talking and laughing up to the point of the construction site, and I probably just hadn't paid attention to what we'd passed. As he approached, his friends crowded around the porta potty. As he approached, he saw his friends crowded around the porta potty, and he realized they were trying to break into it. Now, he'd locked it when he went in, and he began to see that they thought he was still in the cubicle, that something had happened to him, and they were trying to get him out. None of them saw him until he was right up to them, and when they did, all of them freaked out. All of them had seen him go into the porta potty, and all they knew is that he had never come out. They had been trying to get into this Johnny on the spot for well over an hour without dumping it, of course. Steve could tell by their reactions that none of them had pranked him. They gave up on the porta potty, and after consulting a map so that they could get to a populated main road as soon as possible, this was before there were cell phones to do that sort of thing. So you actually used paper maps, so they consulted a map. so that they could get to a more populated main road as soon as possible, they decided to forgo the remainder of their trip and get to a proper rest stop. As they returned to civilization, Steve told them what he'd experienced, and his friends shared their experiences. According to Steve, everyone was pretty quiet after that, and they never traveled in that part of Kansas again. Years later, they could laugh about it, and Steve called it the story of how I teleported out of a porta potty. He would always add at the end, thankfully, I don't know what would have happened if I'd walked the other way down the road. Now we're going to talk a little bit about synchronicities and deja vus. And this is again from Time Storms. In this part of the book, Randalls does talk a lot about Jung and Pauli's discussion of synchronicities, because they developed this theory that what synchronicity was, it had something to do with waves becoming particles. It had something to do with the actual manifestation of physical things, which is interesting. Anyway, I'm not going to go into it more than that. I'm actually reading a book about it right now. I mean, I've read other things about it, but I'm reading another book. But this happened in the 1980s to a family from Leicester in Edinburgh. She calls them the Jenkins family. They went to Edinburgh to visit their daughter who had moved up there. On the spur of the moment, Mr. Jenkins decided to try to find an old friend from his RAF days called McCurdy. They had known each other in the town of Waddenatron in Egypt, but had lost contact since the end of World War II. All he knew was that McCurdy had lived in Edinburgh many years before, but whether he still lived there 40 years later or was even still alive, Mr. Jenkins had no idea. There was one person named McCurdy with the correct initial in the phone book, but just as he was about to dial, Mr. Jenkins chickened out from calling what might be a total stranger. Instead, the family decided to go on a scheduled coach trip to see the sights. However, they then discovered that the trip had been canceled because there had been too few bookings that day. The family searched for a phone box from which to call their daughter, and having found one by a taxi rank, Mrs. Jenkins dialed whilst her husband wandered about aimlessly on the pavement. Then a taxi arrived to discharge the fare, so close that Mr. Jenkins could read the name on the driver's license displayed on the side of the cab. It was his long-lost friend, McCurdy. We've all had those experiences where we've thought of someone out of the blue, all of a sudden, and then like a few days later, they call on the phone. And sometimes you even know, if they're calling on the phone, that it's them. I've had the experience many, many times, more times than I can remember, where all of a sudden I've thought about someone only to find out, like, not long after that they've died, that they've just died, or that they had died exactly 6 months to the day and hour that I thought about them. I've had this happen to me so many times that I can't even tell you how many times. It's very, very strange. But I've had a number of other synchronicities as well as lots of deja vus. For me, deja vus are often accompanied with out-of-body experiences. I'll have an out-of-body experience and then I'll have a deja vu while I'm having it. Sometimes these experiences are while I'm awake. Sometimes they're while I'm asleep and waking up. I think the most notable have occurred during deep meditation practices, where there have been more than one instance where I have literally all of a sudden found myself in a completely different place, sometimes temporally different, sometimes, I mean, I have a whole series of experiences that I've described to other people where I started doing a meditation that had absolutely nothing to do with where I ended up. And then all of a sudden I was with a small troop of Neanderthal individuals while they were hunting. Well, actually, they were waiting for some herds to come in, some seasonal herds to come in, and they were on top of a bluff looking down, and they had built a fire, and they were all just hanging out and doing kind of I don't know exactly, a communal kind of thing. They were kind of communicating with each other in various ways, and just sort of talking about their day. And I was there as a presence, like a dream presence for them. I was very aware of them and what they were saying to each other. They were aware of me. They were also aware of the fact that I was not from their time or place, but they accepted me as being part of their psychic world. And in that experience, I gleaned a lot of information about them, almost all of which, and this happened like 35 years ago, almost all of which has been confirmed by subsequent discoveries about them. In other words, science has since confirmed what I observed of them. I mean, there were some things I observed of them that science cannot confirm. For example, a more than latent telepathic ability that they were quite conscious of, and how they had a different relationship to their bodies, and a different ego structure than what we have. But it was, I remember that experience is one of the most profound experiences I've ever had in a meditation. I've had other experiences, which some people would call past life experiences, but which I now know were actually parallel life experiences. It's from those experiences that I've come to understand that time, as it's experienced with past, present, and future, doesn't really exist, that all those things exist at once. There have been other experiences where I was out of my body, and I had the experience of then being reintroduced back into my body, but entering my body too quickly, resulting in my being out of sync with my body, kind of like these two of the people that I read about were out of sync with their body, which is very uncomfortable. It causes headaches and muscle aches and a kind of dizziness and nausea. And in both instances, took at least 24 hours each time to correct. Usually I had to go back to sleep in order for it to correct itself. I have had many instances of deja vu, whereupon not only did I experience that sense of having done some things before, but received an interior timestamp of when I dreamed it. In other words, I had seemingly dreamt the events before they happened. And for a moment, when I have the deja vu experience, I could vividly remember the dream of those events and when they occurred. Like, you dreamt this 6 months ago, or you dreamt this a month ago, or in one case, you dreamt this 5 years ago. And usually in such instances, the deja vu goes on for a really long time. And anything I do to change the unfolding events are actually part of them, which is very bizarre when that happens. Synchronicities, too many to count. I have synchronicities every month. Stephanie Quick and I talk about them, particularly when I or the world is going through many, many changes. In fact, I rather depend on synchronicities to give me a sense of how the world around me is going to go. And I think that that's the purpose that synchronicities serve, basically. So these are the kinds of events that concern me. And when it comes to the stuff that's happening now, and how this sort of links with that, one of the things that I can say is that I have been having a lot of synchronicities and a lot of dreams and a lot of interesting experiences surrounding what's happening. I've had dreams about authoritarian governments taking over our country for probably 20 years. They don't all end the same, though, and they don't all end badly in the sense that the authoritarian regimes are successful. But what they do portend is that there are a variety of changes that need to be made and that are in the process of being made, both positively and negatively. In other words, the stuff that's going on is stuff that has been in place for a really long time. So pay attention to your dreams. If you meditate, pay attention to what comes up in those meditations. What I think might be a really interesting thing to do during this time of tumult and change is to not only work on connecting with other people, but try to find some creative project. Try to find something creative to do with your energy and your anxiety. In addition to whatever it is you might want to do to resist or to keep track of yourself. It's very, very important to take care of yourself and to make sure that fear is not what is ruling you, because that's exactly what is desired by the more nefarious forces. They want fear to rule you, and they want you all to be afraid of them. But the truth is that, the planet, whatever the planet is going to win in the end. And no authoritarian regime has ever lasted. Authoritarians always overreach. Sometimes terrible things happen in the meantime, and you want to try to keep those terrible things from happening. But the point is that don't give in to the sense that things are lost, because they're not. They're not. The world, the universe is far larger than our imaginings of it. So this is a good time to embrace just how weird and strange the world really is, and see what weirdness and strangeness you can add to it. Because God knows these forces that are trying to control us, that's what they're afraid of. They want to control things. They want to control you. They want to control the world. They think that AI or technology just by itself is the answer to things. I mean, technology is never just the answer to things. Technology comes from us, and people who worry about AI becoming conscious, well, it might be conscious now, but if it is, it's because we are. It's because everything is conscious, so there isn't the necessity to panic over that in an unnecessary way. In any case, check out this book, Time Storms. It's got great stuff in it. It's a lot of fun. Pay attention to your dreams, your meditations, your truths, because they will sustain us.